do you compete for 3 years on the men's swim team and then switch to the women's and you win the championship? I'm sorry, that is a total fraud, and everybody knows it.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man. Here's newly re-elected Florida dweeb governor Ron DeSantis living in a binary world where it's easier to demonize and label the trans community because you don't care about their experiences or understand their differences. Quite a compelling narrative for his audience, though.
And so it's taking away opportunities for young girls, women athletes. They're working hard. They want to win championships. And then you're basically saying you got to compete against biological males. So that's wrong. And in the state of Florida, we are protecting the integrity of women's sports.
So how can he legislate against people he knows nothing about? Maybe if we stopped oversimplifying the conversation about trans women in sports and looked at them as humans, not monsters, we might not be so quick to ban them from stuff. Let's first address the overstated parts of this movement: physiological advantage and ulterior motives. It may be hard to grasp how physiologically a man can become a woman. Sure, months, years of hormone therapy, testosterone reduction, it won't reshape a person's frame. And sports are gender separated because of physiological differences, right? Only because we've chosen to see it that way. Women lose to other women in sports all the time. Men lose to other men, many times based on physiological advantages. We've also chosen to identify trans people by their sex and not their gender, while all they want to be is recognized as who they are. When a trans athlete hears Ron DeSantis and other powerful people calling them a fraud, an intruder in women's sports, and something to be banned, how would that make them feel? Unacceptable? Without purpose? Disgusting? Listen to Leah Thomas, a champion collegiate swimmer who happens to be trans, explaining the identity crisis she faced knowing society wouldn't accept her as a woman.
Thomas earned a spot at her Ivy League dream school, UPenn, on the men's team. But by her sophomore year, she says her gender dysphoria left her depressed and suicidal.
I was barely going to classes. I could really barely get out of bed. And I said, I can't live like this anymore. And I want to be able to do things I enjoy.
Even if it might cost me my swimming career.
Yeah, and that's part of what kept me from transitioning for so long. Trans people don't transition for athletics. We transition to be happy and authentic and our true selves. Transitioning to get an advantage is not something that ever factors into our decisions.
Athletes who transition are not doing it to get medals. They're doing it so they don't feel like strangers in their own skin for the rest of their lives. Now, what are the parts of the trans athletes issue we never hear about? Well, the integrity of women's sports overall and trans men. Funny thing is, the integrity of women's sports has been more severely damaged by other factors, while politicians and pundits say trans women are 100% of the problem. Women's sports have historically had less viewership than men's because they're given worse time slots on auxiliary channels. Games have lower attendance unless athletes bring home multiple titles. Female athletes have had to rally for equitable pay because commissioners and other leadership won't push for it. They're constantly judged by their attitudes and appearance on top of their performance.
I just said she's probably the greatest gymnast of all time. She's also very selfish, she's immature, and she is a shame to the country.
And women's sports have allowed for sexual harassment and assault of athletes to be swept under the rug. So you're gonna tell me that a trans woman competing against possibly beating your daughter at an event is more atrocious than everything I just mentioned? Well, then we're not having a thoughtful discussion. We can't address anything until we ask ourselves why we demand more from female athletes to warrant our support, but don't protect them from bullies, sexism, and abusive leadership. And can I just add that we have a WNBA star living in a Russian penal colony right now? LeBron would be home by now. Trans female athletes are not trying to win more trophies. So Why aren't we having to argue the same for trans men? If Katie Ledecky or Candace Parker were trans, there would be so many men who couldn't beat them at their own game. Where's the uproar over trans male athletes like Chris Mosier, who earned a spot on Team USA's spring duathlon men's team for the 2016 World Championship? Skylar Bylar, one of the first transgender athletes to compete on an NCAA Division I men's team. Because it's not the point right-wingers are trying to make. If they use the narrative of women fighting for success only to have it taken away by opportunistic men, they can call out feminists who support trans athletes as anti-women and then claim moral superiority, even though this is the only women's issue that the right cares about. So, to what end is this movement against trans athletes going to be had? Will trans women have to have their own league? Will they only be able to compete against men? Will they just have to live in a country where they can't play sports? Will this become more than an issue of sex for the right wing? Like, will we eliminate black basketball and football players from sports because they're disproportionately taking white men's spots? Let me know your thoughts on the future of trans athletes, and if you have any story suggestions, I'd like to hear them in the comments below. Keep the hope, and I'll see you next time.